I'm going to be doing a couple of different readings, so I'm going to do a couple of short readings from a couple of different books. The first one I'm going to do is from Wolf Unleashed, which is a story about the fight for civil rights for werewolves. One of the main characters, Crystal, has bought a werewolf slave, and this is what happens when her father finds out. Thomas opened the front door a little and peered round it, careful to keep most of his body hidden so it wouldn't be immediately obvious that he wasn't restrained in any way. A somewhat familiar older black man stood outside, looking with obvious curiosity at Thomas. Then his eyes locked on the collar around his neck, and curiosity turned to anger. Thomas waited for the inevitable tirade about how he was a dangerous animal and should be put down and shouldn't be answering the door to normal people. "I'm going to kill Chris," the man said. Thomas was so caught off guard that he couldn't think of a suitable response and only managed to say, "She's out at a meeting right now, you'll have to wait." The man surprised him by giving a little snort of laughter. When he smiled, Thomas suddenly realised why the man looked familiar. This man appeared in many of the photographs on the living room wall, often with a much younger Crystal. Thomas guessed that this man was her father, or perhaps a favourite uncle. Thomas moved aside and held the door open wider. The man stepped inside, and as Thomas closed the front door, the man surprised him again by offering his hand to shake. "Ethan Baker." Thomas looked at the hand in confusion for a moment, but then took it cautiously. "Thomas." They stood awkwardly in the hall, but Ethan seemed surprisingly relaxed to be in the presence of a werewolf. Thomas kept replaying the handshake in his thoughts, and the way the man had laughed like it had been a deliberate joke. His usual streak of rebellion urged at him to push, to see how far he could take this. Thomas was supposed to be servile, but he couldn't help wondering how much like Crystal this man might prove to be. And it wasn't like Ethan had the controls to the collar. "Can I offer you something?" he asked. "Tea? Coffee? A murder weapon?" Ethan gave another little laugh. "Black coffee and a sharp implement suitable for stabbing." Thomas led the way into the kitchen and put the kettle on. He fetched a mug from the cupboard, and while he waited for the kettle to boil, he picked a steak knife out of the drawer and set it down on the table next to where Ethan was sitting. Baker picked it up and looked at it thoughtfully. He looked back at Thomas. "Is Crystal a good owner?" he asked. Thomas considered the question. He knew what he ought to say. He could also guess what the man wanted to hear. Thomas shrugged. "If you really did try to stab her," he said, "I'd probably stop you." "Probably? That's not much of an endorsement." "It's not something I'd say about anybody else who thought they owned me." "Interesting way of phrasing it." Thomas shrugged again. The water was boiling now. After a moment of consideration, Thomas got out a second mug. Ethan hadn't said anything yet about his inappropriate behaviour, so he spooned coffee granules into both mugs. "Are you a good slave?" Crystal's dad asked. Thomas wondered if he should lie. He decided against it because Crystal would probably make her own comments, and Ethan had already seen him speaking inappropriately. "No," he said. "I've been described as willful, stubborn, disrespectful, disobedient, and sarcastic." He missed out the fact that his record contained multiple references to his violent tendencies. Ethan didn't need to know that, particularly since Thomas had no intention of hurting Crystal. Her dad just laughed again. "Sounds like you're a perfect match for Chris." So the second one I want to read from is from a different book. This is Shadows of Tomorrow, a story about parallel worlds and creatures breaking through from another dimension and the people whose job it is to stop them. So this is from near the start. A hand rested on Gareth's shoulder, a warm attempt at comfort that couldn't quite reach through the grief. Adrian Boren, second in command, stood beside Gareth, looking at the coffins. "We're ready," Boren said. Ready to hear the supposed wisdom of the defence master, ready to be told that the world wasn't as terrible as it seemed in that moment. ready for Gareth to speak. Gareth had rarely felt less ready, but he did what he must. He turned to face the gathered defenders, lines of men and the occasional woman, almost all of them older than him, and yet looking at him to lead. Their faces were grave and serious, each with their memories of the departed, their pain and anger. Gareth took a breath, trying to swallow down his own pain, bury it inside so that he could speak with clarity. "We all know the risks," he said. "We know what might be asked of us. We stand as warriors and protectors, knowing how high the cost might be. We stand between this world and the outsiders, between the innocent and the death that would take them. Is there a more selfless act than to stand between a monster and a complete stranger? To put yourself in harm's way, to save people you've never even met? These 5 men made that sacrifice. These 5 chose the selfless path. I've spoken to each of them about being a defender, about the dangers of the life we lead. I believe Pip summed it up best. Gareth had been moving slowly along the lines of coffins. Now he stood by the smallest, bearing the young Chinese defender who'd been known, almost to an official level, as Pipsqueak, or Pip because of his height. "Pip told me," Gareth continued, "that if his death meant just one more person living who would otherwise have died, it would be worth it. I don't know how many people are alive today because of these 5, but it's far more than one. Thank you, Pip, for your sacrifice, and farewell." Gareth touched a hand to his heart and then to Pip's forehead, his fingertips brushing the dead flesh. He moved along the line, repeating the final words and gesture, bidding goodbye to their teammates. Boren was a step behind him, looking down at the coffins and saying his own words of parting. Then came the others, moving from their places in slow procession, senior defenders first, with the others following, one by one. Each wanting to say something, each knowing that one day it could be them lying in this place. Gareth slipped from the hall while the others were still gathered around the coffins. He moved quietly down the corridor to one of the smaller training rooms, leaving the door open a crack, an implicit invitation to Carl, who'd followed him out. This room was one of many along the hall, little but well equipped for private practice, and Gareth headed straight for the punch bag hanging in the back corner. He didn't bother with gloves or padding. Sometimes it was good to feel the sting of skin against leather, because the physical pain helped deal with the guilt. He'd known that the portal would open. He'd known that those 5 would be the first response team. And he'd known that they'd be coming home as corpses.